My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and recently I came across a new fan film called Horn of Gondor, released in 2020, and this video is going to be basically a review of it. So I'm going to get into the plot, what it's about. I'm going to talk about things that I liked about it, things that I don't like about it. It's going to be a short one because it's a short fan film, even compared to other fan films in this, the Tolkien universe. So there's not going to be a whole lot that I have to say about it, but there are a few things that I think are definitely worth noting. So let's get into it. So as far as the basic plot of the film, we start off with some narration by some kind of scribe or something like that in Gondor, and from his narration we get the idea that this is after the ascension of Aragorn to the throne. So he's reminiscing about Rohan and how the nation of Rohan came to be, and he starts explaining that originally the people of Rohan were far to the north and called something entirely different, and he starts getting into how it was that they came to be in Rohan as opposed to far in the north, and it's a time of war in Gondor, and the steward at the time, Cirion, decides to send messengers to the Eotheod, which is what they're called at the time, to request their aid in the wars that they're engaged in. And this is all true to the book. I mean, if you read the appendices and get into the history of Gondor, this is all accurate, pretty much. I mean, they add details to fill in the story, of course, but the general thrust of it is pretty much identical to what you're going to get in the books. So he sends, I think it's 6 or 7 messengers, and then we get into kind of their story, and pretty quickly it goes downhill. I mean, almost immediately we find out that all but one of them ends up getting killed along the way, and the story of this one guy is really what the film is about. And his story kind of starts after all the other ones are dead, and we see him riding alone kind of slowly on a horse, and then the horse kind of just lays down, and he gets off, and he sees that the horse, which he had apparently previously bandaged, the horse has a wound on its leg, and they kind of lay down. He makes camp, and you get the idea that the horse probably dies, and so, but regardless of whether the horse dies or not, he has to carry on foot. So he continues walking along. We do get visuals also kind of sporadically of bad guys who are hunting for him, and it's, these guys don't have the same kind of budget for prosthetics, of course, that the movies did, and so it's not 100% clear what they're supposed to be, but I'm guessing there's at least one Easterling and one orc in the group. But anyway, he ends up walking along and eventually reaches this forest and reaches a high point there, and he takes out his horn and he blows a really long, loud blast on it. So that's, this is kind of where the name of the fan film comes from, basically. Well, unfortunately, the horn blast kind of gives away his position, and the bad guys find him, and so he ends up having to fight them. And eventually, he takes out all of them except one, and they have this really long, drawn-out fight scene. And frankly, the fight scene is kind of like a lot of what this movie is, because the rest of it is kind of short, and this is the most drawn-out aspect of it. But at the end of this fight scene, he's, on the ground, and the bad guy's about to get him, and then they hear a horn, or maybe it was something else. I'm getting confused now, because there's actually an alternate ending to this fan film, and I'll link to the fan film and the alternate ending in the description below so you can check them out. But one way or the other, in the original version of it, he's, about to be killed, and then some kind of noise, and I think it's a horn from the Eotheod, or what will become the Rohirrim, stops the bad guy, and they take care of, well, the bad guy gets killed, and the messenger from Gondor, of course, delivers his message after one of the Rohirrim who comes along, basically said that that horn blast doesn't belong in our, and it's, I should mention too, the people who are involved in this are definitely not English speakers, and you can tell that too. There's some dubbing and sometimes it's a little obvious that it's dubbed. But the way that it's worded sounds a little awkward here, but the impression that I'm getting is that he's saying that that horn blast either is something that it's not one of their kind of horns and therefore they didn't recognize it, or else it's like a really powerful horn blast and it's like, we're looking for this person that did this because that's unusual. It's not exactly clear from the wording what was supposed to be conveyed, but that's kind of the idea I got. But anyway, the guy basically said your search is over, and he delivers his message and calls for aid. And you get the idea, of course, that they're going to accept, which of course they do. And then it returns to the narration, and the narrator tells us how they came, from the north and helped Gondor win a battle, and as a reward, basically, Cirion the steward gave them the land of Rohan to live in. So that's pretty much the plot. It's pretty short. There's not a whole lot to it. But let me talk about some things that I like and things that I don't like. So starting off with the things that I don't like first, so we can end on a positive note. The two main things that I kind of found disappointing, and it's not bad per se, it's really just disappointing, is how short the film is. It's really short. I think the whole thing is 15 minutes or less, and a lot of that is either narration or credits. In fact, when it finished, I was like, the credits seemed like half the movie. It's not really half the movie, but it seemed like it just because so much of it is narration, and most of the actual action in the movie ends up being the fight scene between the hero and the bad guys. So, it's just really short. There's just not a whole lot to it. I think they could have, it would have been nice if there would have been a little bit more to it and a little more of a story arc there, and not just basically two scenes, him having to leave his horse and then fighting a bunch of bad guys. So that was one thing. And again, it's a fan film. I'm not, blaming anybody for this. Fan films are not exactly easy to produce. They're not cheap, and they take a lot of time and effort. So I'm not faulting anybody for that. It's just, it would have been nice if there was more to it. The other thing is some of the English dubbing, like I mentioned, these guys are not native English speakers. You can tell from their names, which I won't try to pronounce because I'm familiar with Romance languages mainly in the real world, and I don't know how to pronounce a whole lot outside of that. And these guys are not Romance languages based on their names. So, but whoever they are, they had to do English dubbing. And it's mentioned in the credits, that they had English dubbed, stuff done because the actors' names and the voiceover are different people. But sometimes the dubbing is not super well done, or at least it doesn't seem super well done. It may just be like the first half of the movie, I didn't even really notice that it was dubbed. And it may just be that the lip syncing with the voiceover just happened to match up really well with the two different languages. Or maybe in the second half, they just didn't try as hard. I don't know what it is. But for whatever reason, in the second half, towards the end, I started to notice it more, especially in the final conversation between the main character and the Theotheod characters. So there's a little bit of that. And, it's not a big deal, any English dubbed movie or anything like that, that's a live action movie, you're going to have those issues. It's kind of unavoidable. But that's kind of the only two things that really stood out to me that I didn't particularly care for. And like I said, both of those are like, they're not anything that I fault the filmmakers for. They're just, they're just slight disappointments. Things that I liked about the movie, I think they did a pretty good job with the costumes. I will say that. And they did a good job with kind of sticking to the Peter Jackson aesthetic, considering the much less limited resources they probably had. And the thing is, like the extent to which they had to stick to the aesthetic is not even, they didn't have to do it 100% because this movie is talking about events that took place, at least 500 years prior to the events of the Lord of the Rings, so they could have fudged it a little bit, but they actually did a really good job of looking pretty similar to, the aesthetic in the Lord of the Rings. So kudos there. I mean, they did a really good job with the costuming and all that stuff. The orc character obviously doesn't look like a Peter Jackson orc, but again, they don't have Weta Workshop. So, but But the most interesting thing, actually, that I liked about this movie was in the fight scene with the main character against all the bad guys. I'm the fighting actually seemed really well done, and I don't know what these guys are into, but one of my side interests actually is historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short. And there's several channels that I don't necessarily subscribe to all of them, but I watch their videos kind of frequently on different aspects about historical European things like castle building and how they fought and all that kind of stuff, because I'm just always been interested in knights in armor and stuff. So that's one of my side interests. And based on the stuff that I've seen in those channels and then what I see in this video, I almost wonder if these guys had either somebody in their group that was into HEMA, or they just got somebody on the outside to kind of give them pointers on how to do sword fights in the HEMA style, because a lot of what the main character does in terms of how he sword fights seems like at least semi-legitimate sword fighting for a guy using a longsword. So I don't, I'm no expert in this area. I'm only going off of what I've seen in the other channels that I've followed, but it seems pretty legit. And at least, it's not like the sword fighting and whatnot is not obviously like grotesquely bad, for sure. There are a few points where you could quibble, and there's always points where you could quibble with sword fights in movies because it has to be choreographed and they have to keep the actors safe. But I have to say, I was actually really impressed with the sword fighting in this movie. Like, it was maybe the best, most impressive thing about it. And so for that alone, it's worth watching if you're into Lord of the Rings and you're into HEMA, because it's a really interesting conjunction of the two as far as I'm concerned. And just for reference, some of the channels that I like to follow on that topic are Shadiversity, Scala Gladiatoria, Scalagrim, and I want to say there was another one, but I'll link to all their channels in the description below so you can check them out if you want to get more info on that sort of thing, and maybe look at some of their videos on how medieval longsword fighting was done, because this guy's obviously fighting in a longsword style. He doesn't have a sword and shield, it's a longsword. But anyway, that was, to me, one of the most interesting things about this film, and I thought it was really impressive. So those are my thoughts on the Horn of Gondor. Congrats, guys, on a pretty well-made fan film. Short, could have been longer, but I liked it. It was, definitely enjoyable, worth a watch. Won't take up a whole lot of your time, so do check it out yourself. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can also, of course, follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. And you can subscribe to the channel here, and you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.